So, colleagues, I am really happy to introduce our first speaker. It will be Mark Wilkie from ГаффниКлан, and he is the Carbon Management Director for Europe, Africa, Middle East in ГаффниКлан, and he prepared very good, I hope, and I believe so, presentation about energy transition. So, Mr. Wilkie, let's start.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to share some insights and perspectives. Today I'm going to talk about where carbon pricing is moving from a global perspective and how we at ГаффниКlан are seeing it impacting on investment decisions and strategic decisions within this whole energy transition movement. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope you'll be able to see it. So you should be able to see my screen, hopefully.
Yeah, everything is okay. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, to start off with, I thought it would be useful just to kind of take a look at what is happening generally within the carbon markets and carbon pricing. And carbon pricing is certainly seen by the UN International Panel for Climate Change as one of the key instruments for supporting reduction in carbon emissions and in supporting the energy transition. But they also see the importance of using carbon pricing in conjunction with policy. And I think it's fair to say that things are moving and evolving very, very quickly. This is a snapshot of headlines over the last 6 to 9 months just in this year. And you probably saw some of the news coming out of COP26. One of the items in COP26 to be resolved, which was still outstanding for 5 years now, was something called Article 6, which was around establishing a global carbon market. And thankfully, out of the COP26 session, there was some agreement, although the details have yet to be finalized. But essentially, through COP26, there's an agreement between the nations of establishing carbon trading. So that's to say, to take credits from carbon removal projects and allow those to be used by other nations to reduce their reported emissions. Within the EU, as we'll see, there is both quite some growth in carbon pricing through the emissions trading scheme, the ETS. And there's also quite some developments going on which will impact not just Europe, but also a number of its major trading partners. And Russia is obviously one of those partners. China earlier this year launched its emissions trading scheme and became the biggest carbon market globally, although the price at the moment is still uncertain in terms of volumes of emissions. It is now the biggest. And even the US have started to consider some kind of policy around carbon pricing, and also considering a similar mechanism to Europe for potentially bringing in a tariff for goods that are imported into the US. So I think, you know, carbon pricing is going to be crucial going forward. It is moving really rapidly, and as you'll see here, it is still relatively limited in terms of its actual geographic scope. So if you see the map on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a lot of gray, a lot of space, and these are countries that have yet to either implement a clear policy on pricing or to have some kind of net zero target. However, the countries you see in dark green are those that have both a very clear carbon pricing policy and have net zero targets. Some as early as 2035, some going out to 2060. And in the lighter green, you see those countries that just have a carbon pricing policy. On the right-hand side, the donut you see there really indicates the size of each of the three main carbon pricing mechanisms. So the first one, the ETS, the emissions trading scheme. So this is a market-based cap and trade scheme. So a limit is set, allowances are traded within that market. And that by far is currently the biggest in terms of volume. So that mechanism covers about 16% of global emissions currently. There is also carbon taxation. This tends to be more niche, so targeting certain energy sources or certain sectors. And that at the moment represents about 6% of global carbon emissions. Both of those schemes are what we call compliance driven schemes. So that's to say it's a legal and a regulatory obligation to comply with those schemes. And finally, we have carbon credit schemes, which is generally a voluntary scheme where projects can register. So carbon removal projects can register in international registries to issue carbon credits according to the emissions those projects can remove. And that, as you can see, is very, very small. So probably less than 1%. So at the moment, carbon pricing, although it's moving quickly and it is expanding rather rapidly, it is coming from a relatively low base. So at the moment, only 22% of global emissions are covered. The two big schemes, one is the European emission trading scheme, and the second one is the Chinese emission trading scheme. Now, if we look at how this potentially impacts not just energy producers, not just oil and gas, but actually the big energy consumers, you'll see from this center graph the spread of carbon emission intensity by sector, and intensity in terms of the amount of CO2 emitted for every €1,000,000 earned in terms of revenue. And what you see immediately from this graph is that there is actually quite a range. There are some sectors that are more intensive, so that's to say they emit more CO2 for every euro or dollar earned than others. And midway down, you'll see oil and gas just underneath electric utilities. And although oil and gas has quite a high carbon intensity, it is by no means the largest in terms of revenue. So cement at the top, you can see by far is the greatest, and also has huge spread between the highest intensity, so the worst performers, and the lowest intensity in terms of the best performers. The other standouts are metals and mining, which include aluminium. Steel is also a big one. Power generation from electricity utilities, oil and gas, as we're probably all aware. And then transport services, so this is both aviation as well as surface transportation. On the right-hand graph, you see some basic carbon pricing scenarios. So that's to say, what would happen at different pricing levels on the impacted revenue for each of those sectors. In green, you see a notional tariff of €50 a tonne, going up to €100 a tonne in the grey, to €150 a tonne in the red. And in this graph, you see the impact as a percentage of potential revenue. And again, what you see from this is that the big energy consumers, so the groups, the sectors that are taking the energy to produce their goods, are going to be most significantly impacted. Again, starting with cement, with a range of anywhere between 25 to close to 80% of their revenue potentially impacted. Again, steel, close to 20% at 150 euros a ton. And then also power generation. So here you can see that actually with some moderate changes in carbon pricing, there could potentially be very big financial impacts to some of those bigger energy users, bigger emitting industries. So next, I just want to maybe describe a little more in terms of how the different mechanisms work, the nuances of each. And I'd say that there are really primarily three mechanisms: carbon taxation, emission trading schemes, which is a cap and trade scheme, and carbon credits. And each of these have their pros and their cons, so their advantages and disadvantages, and have differing levels of impact. It is possible in some markets where you see both carbon taxation and ETS, so it isn't necessarily that they have to be done independently. And as I say before, the carbon tax and the ETS schemes are usually a regulated scheme, so it is a legal obligation to comply with those, versus the carbon credit scheme, which is generally a voluntary project scheme. So on carbon taxation, the principle is that the emissions are given a known and a predefined value, and in some cases that value is escalated over time. The price by nature is stable, and it really helps in terms of being able to utilize that within your financial models, because you know exactly how a reduction of the carbon emissions will potentially give you earnings in terms of savings in terms of avoiding taxation. The difficulty with carbon taxation is that by setting the value, first of all, you could potentially be in a situation where the tax level is too high or too low according to your overall emissions target. So the target, the taxation rate is generally set, and then it isn't only until after the taxation rate is set that the actual emissions reduction will be known. So it's a little uncertain in terms of the emission level forecast. Then the ETS scheme, which is by far the biggest at the moment. This is a market-driven scheme, relatively complex. There is some volatility, but as you'll see from the European scheme, there is a general trend upwards. And the way the scheme works is that specific emitters are designated, are defined as having to comply with this scheme and are set an emissions target. There are a number of allowances within the trading scheme, and those allowances can be traded between groups that are saving or reducing emissions and those that are going over their limit in order to reduce their emissions. So the real advantage for this type of scheme is that an emissions target can be set, and then the price will move up and move down depending on whether the actual emissions are ahead or behind that target. So in principle, it's the most cost-efficient mechanism. The last one, which is kind of the smallest, and you'll probably see this most often when we talk about nature-based offsets. These are relatively small projects which can be registered under international registers, and for every unit of carbon that can be removed, every ton of carbon that can be removed, a certificate is issued. And again, it's a market-based scheme, so it really relies on companies wanting to buy those credits in order to reduce their reported emissions, in order to drive the price of those credits. Here you'll see a selection of the ETS schemes on the left-hand side and a selection of the carbon taxation schemes on the right-hand side. In the grey windows, this is what the UN International Panel for Climate Change has designated as, let's say, the ideal carbon price window or corridor in order for carbon emissions to be reduced. So in 2020, they were recommending a carbon price corridor of between 40 to 80 euros, sorry, $40 to $80 per ton of CO2. And you'll see from each of those schemes where they sit within that window. And again, it's clear that very few schemes currently are high enough in terms of price in order to meet that window. So that's to say, the carbon pricing in general, where it is being implemented, is still a lot lower than it should be. And at the moment, in terms of volume, it means that probably less than 4% of global emissions currently sit within that recommended window. Now, the consequence of that is that actually, if the ambitions, if the targets are to be met, then pricing will have to increase. And that is something to be aware of. So the current prices we see today are probably far lower than they may be in the medium term. Going a bit more detail and giving an example of each of the key mechanisms. So the ETS in the EU was established over 15 years ago, so it's been around for some time. It's going through its fifth or sixth revision. It covers both direct and indirect emissions, so scope 1, scope 2. It currently includes both the EU states and a number of the European trading areas, so likes of Iceland and Norway. It currently covers aviation, power, and some of the bigger energy intensive industries such as steel and chemicals. And recently the target for 2030 was to reduce emissions across the EU by 40%. And that has been recently revised to 55%, and looks like it could even increase to 60% or over 60% by 2030. In addition, the sectors that it currently covers are going to expand. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key elements that is due to be implemented and start from 2020, 2026 is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I think there's a dedicated session tomorrow on the CBAM scheme, so I won't go into too much detail there, but essentially this is a scheme to price carbon on both energy and products that are being imported from outside of the EU into the EU. And the primary purpose is to protect heavy emitting industries within the EU from foreign producers that are not currently subject to carbon pricing. But by nature, it will also start to drive those foreign producers to reduce their emissions. And Russia is a big trading partner with the EU around iron and steel. fertilizers, on phosphates, even power and aluminium. And so those industries, potentially are going to see some impact once that mechanism is implemented. The snapshot on the right-hand side, you'll see, was actually taken in October, showing a price of around 58 euros. As recently as the end of November, that price had exceeded 70 euros. So you can see here that, again, the price is moving upwards, and it's moving really, really rapidly. The second scheme mechanism, just as an example, is the industry carbon taxation scheme introduced in the Netherlands. This was brought in at the end of 2020 and became live beginning of this year. And the Dutch government decided that there was a number of key industries which had not made sufficient progress. And so they brought in a carbon tax on those industries, and it covers about 235 companies. It works in tandem with the ETS, but it sets a floor price. So again, it sets certainty. So it is targeted at industrial emitters only. It tends to be the larger, heavy industrial emitters, and there is a price set for each year. And of course, in the short term, that's going to cause a bit of pain for those industries. But in the medium term, it will also give them certainty in terms of how they should be making their investments to reduce those emissions. The third scheme I wanted to quickly mention was the tax credit scheme introduced in the US to support investment in carbon capture and storage. And it's a scheme that, again, was implemented some time ago, but we are seeing growing interest from investors as well as producers and emitters to try and utilize this carbon tax credit scheme. And a bit like the carbon taxation, the tax credit is a fixed known price. It runs for a period of 12 years, and it is escalated over those 12 years. So from an investor point of view, it really gives a strong certainty in terms of the revenue that can be earned from those carbon capture and storage projects. The scheme is going to go through another version next year. So at the moment, there are two tariffs, one for capturing and utilization, or for enhanced oil recovery, which is about $35 a ton, sorry. And there is a second tariff at the moment, which is $50 per ton for capture and permanent storage. And the second one will increase, we believe, to around $85 a ton, probably by the end of next year. So those are kind of examples of where each of those three mechanisms are being implemented around the globe. Next, I just wanted to kind of share with you some insights in terms of where our clients have and show some interest in where carbon pricing is going and how that kind of influences their decision making. So very often, or increasingly often now, we are looking at future carbon pricing scenarios on a producer's portfolio and how that impacts their potential cost of production, and also how that positions them globally against other producers. We're also looking from a project perspective. So we have a number of clients that have a target or wanting to completely decarbonize their production. And an important part of this is really to understand the relative costs to reduce those emissions by solution. And so what we do is we produce a marginal cost abatement curve. So for every solution, every technology that can create a reduction in emissions, we calculate a cost per ton of CO2 reduced. We're seeing some increasing interest in hydrogen production, initially on blue hydrogen production, so taking natural gas through a standard reforming process and using carbon capture to take away the CO2 emissions. And again, carbon pricing has a role to play in terms of understanding the price sensitivity, the cost sensitivity of hydrogen versus a conventional natural gas or even a liquids fuel supply, which is relatively more carbon intensive. The one I wanted to share with you in a bit more detail is using it to assess the investment opportunity for carbon capture and storage. And this is really understanding what the relative costs are, again, in terms of cost per ton captured, cost per ton transported, and ultimately stored. And we are looking across the full CO2 value chain, so all the way from emission through to storage. And yeah, basically we start with trying to identify potential CO2 sources, both in terms of the volume, but also the type of emission, and I'll show you later the importance of that, within the radius of either a pipeline or potential depleted reservoirs or aquifers that we could use as stores. We then assess from a techno-economic point the case for capturing those CO2 sources. We look at validating the capacity, the injectivity, the integrity of the stores. Again, that validation process ultimately ends up in a cost. So we're looking at the potential cost for a particular sink store to store that CO2. We conduct a regional mapping of all those potential stores and come up with the optimal stores, given the volumes to be sequestered and given the relative costs of each of those ones, and then in the end build a financial investment case. For the various CO2 sources, the cost of capturing those is very much dependent upon the pressure of the emission stream and the concentration. And what you see is those that are emitted at higher pressures, higher concentrations, are a lower cost than those that are emitted at atmospheric pressures and lower concentrations. And an example of that is on natural gas processing, which is a higher concentration rate, and power generation post-combustion, which is a lot lower concentration at atmospheric pressure. And so the complexity of capturing those different sources varies quite widely, and therefore the cost and the size of that equipment also varies quite widely. And again, a measure of that is in terms of what it costs per ton to be captured. What we see here is that there are a number of those high pressure, high concentration sources that are a lot lower in cost when you compare it with some of those lower concentration sources from post-combustion. And those higher concentration ones are typically sources that also already have some capture equipment built in to the process. So for gas processing, for example, which again further reduces those costs. If we look at carbon pricing then, and how that affects the viability of capturing those sources. The capture ready ones, the ammonia, the ethylene oxide, those are gas processing, those are ones we're calling capture ready. And at the moment, a $35 per ton carbon price would make all of those viable. If we look a bit further up in terms of capture for hydrogen, so blue hydrogen production, that $50 per ton would enable that type of scheme to become viable, but it's still too low for the post-combustion, low intensity, low pressure emissions. For those to be captured, you really need somewhere between 75, maybe even $100 a ton before you start to see some potential to reduce those emissions using CCUS. So just to conclude and wrap up, what you'll see is the coverage of carbon pricing is still relatively limited, but it is growing. It's growing very, very quickly. And as you can see, even the schemes that are outside of particular countries are starting to bring in and have impact on their trading partners. Heavy industrial consumers are probably going to be the highest impacted to begin with. The pricing we're seeing in general is probably too low. So, you know, what we see globally as pricing is definitely going to go upwards. There is only one direction if it's to become a useful instrument. Our clients are certainly increasingly looking to carbon pricing as part of their decision making. And we're seeing from a carbon capture and storage point that the price in certain markets where it exists is beginning to get to that tipping point to make it viable. And so we see that as becoming a big opportunity, certainly within the short to medium term. With that, I'd like to invite any questions.
Thank you, dear Mark. It was a really brilliant presentation. I think everybody can confirm that you provided us with all the tools for energy transition in Russia and any countries. So thank you for this kind of excurse. So, my dear colleagues, if you want to give any question, just raise your hands. But as we suppose, and I have this right, I can start with the questions. And the first question is, how will carbon prices potentially impact an energy production in Russia? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, when you see that map and there's still a gray space for Russia, I think it's easy to assume that, you know, maybe nothing is happening, but I think we are seeing growing interest from both producers and manufacturers. And I think a lot of that is really on the expectation of potential impact with the changes in the European trading scheme. So I think from an energy production point, it's probably going to both potentially impact gas export, because there will be a price associated with carbon intensity, and that will be a cost added to the cost of supply. And I think also within Russia, again, those industries, the iron and steel, fertilizer, aluminium, those heavy energy industries will also be impacted, because their products will also have a carbon price associated with the energy that they're using. So I think in the short term, there's not much tangible impact, but you can see in maybe 5-6 years' time, there could definitely be some challenges, which now is the time to kind of address.
Thank you for your answer. If there is any questions, round.
I see a request to provide presentations. I think all the presentations will be shared on the SPE website.
Excuse me, I guess there's some questions in the chat, in the Zoom chat.
Yes, we noticed already and answered that all the presentations will be provided by the organizers of this conference. It will be available very soon.
Okay, I see that question from Nikita Petrachkov. Okay, I can read it. I'd like to ask about RIC, Renewable Identification Number system, that is used in USA now. Is it some kind of carbon pricing? Can you say something about it?
Yeah, there's something called a Renewable Energy Certification Scheme, so a REC and IREC. It's really there to manage the trading of renewable power. And yeah, it's used actually in a number of countries. I believe actually Russia is looking to introduce it. So it's really not associated directly with carbon pricing, but it clearly has an impact on the carbon emissions associated with the power that you buy. So that's to say, if you buy a renewable energy certificate, you can claim that the power you're using has no emission. It's fully renewable.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I saw that Darcy, you had a question.
I was going to ask Mark a quick question if I could jump the
Sure,
queue.
yeah, please.
I'm a presenter, so I got the feed. Hey, Mark, excellent summary. Wondering if you could comment on the difficulty of the European trading system because it crosses so many borders versus carbon trading systems that are supported by one jurisdiction. I just find it very fascinating, and
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your comments versus the Canadian system that's very well defined per province and robust.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think there's a huge amount of sensitivity both within Europe and outside of Europe from a trading agreement point. And I think that's why there's going to be such a long lead time into this. So we're talking 2021 now. There will start to be the framework established around 22, 23, and then implementation will start 2026. But even in implementation, it will be phased. Now, the real complexity of this, beyond the sensitivity between being seen as a potential tax barrier or a trade barrier, is the complexity of being able to assess the intensity of a product produced in one country to another. So that's to say, how do you take, or what do you use as a benchmark for steel produced in Canada or Russia or India? How do you calculate that? And then how do you track that all the way through to the delivery? Now then there's another layer of complexity, and that's to say, well, maybe you're not just buying the steel, maybe you're buying it as a chassis for a car or a frame for a building. Now, of course, it still may be manufactured in that other country, but again, how are you going to assess it? So it is sensitive from a world trade and trade barrier perspective. So there's some care being done on that, and then practically from an administrative point, you can imagine it's going to be very complicated in terms of calculation and so on. But I think there is going to be a scheme, if I'm right, a session tomorrow, Anna, on CBAM. I saw on the agenda. But I'd be happy to talk more.
Thank you very much, dear Mark. We have to keep our schedule. It is
yeah.
So thank you for your full information and really brilliant presentation. We will use it for our future, I hope.